Okay, without any further ado, welcome again. Good morning for those on the West Coast and good afternoon for those on the East Coast. My name is Alex Score. I'm a scientist with EcoAdapt, and I will be helping moderate the webinar today. A little bit of housekeeping rules before we get started, just to ensure we have a successful webinar. I please ask all attendees to place your phone or telephone or computer on mute. This will help reduce any feedback. We will have plenty of time after presentations for questions and answers. Throughout the webinar, though, you can also use the questions function found on the control panel to submit questions to the specific presenters. We will do our best to answer all questions. You can also raise your hand and we will be able to unmute you to ask a question directly to our presenters. And the hand should be function is associated right next to your name. You can also use the chat function below to report any technical issues or problems you might be encountering. We'll do the best to try to address any technical issues and help you get back onto the webinar to ensure you have a favorable experience. The chat function can also be used to communicate between presenters and attendees on ways to emphasize the points heard during a presentation, or if you heard something you really like or something that relates to some work that you're doing, it's good to communicate with other attendees on the webinar as well. So we encourage you to engage with your fellow colleagues that way. Finally, I wanted to let you know that we will be recording and posting the webinar on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website. You'll be able to find this on cakex.org/NAF/webinars. We'll put that link also at the end of the presentation. Next slide. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you our first two speakers. The webinar today is titled The State of Climate Change Adaptation in Water Resources of the Southeast United States and U.S. Caribbean. It is with true pleasure that I get to introduce two of my dearest colleagues, Rachel Gregg, lead scientist with EcoAdapt. She serves as the manager and creator of the State of Adaptation program and serves as the content editor for the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange. She brings expertise in survey design and analysis, identifying and evaluating climate adaptation actions, developing guidance to support decision-making and management in a changing climate, and communicating climate impact and response strategies to diverse audiences. She serves as an adaptation expert in different capacities, including acting as a reviewer for the IPCC Fifth Assessment and also as a contributing author to the National Climate Assessment. And our other colleague, Whitney, is an associate science with EcoAdapt and provides key research and workshop support to both the adaptation consultation and state of adaptation programs. She has earned a Bachelor of Science degree at Santa Clara University and double majored in both environmental science and biology. She comes from a broad science background and has conducted field research in both terrestrial and aquatic systems and worked on various environmental initiatives and environmental justice campaigns in the U.S., Argentina, Ecuador, and the Galapagos Islands. Without further ado, ladies, Rachel, I think you're next. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thanks so much, Alex. Appreciate it, and thanks for having us today, and thanks, everybody, for joining us. We're going to be presenting today some interim results from our project and also some case study examples on climate-informed water resources in the Southeast and U.S. Caribbean. So in thinking about responding to and preparing for climate change, these are the two primary approaches, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, of course, we're thinking of decreasing our carbon emissions or increasing carbon uptake and storage. Adaptation, we're thinking about how we prepare for and respond to the changes that we're already seeing on the ground and or expected to experience in the future. There is this third response that still permeates various regions and sectors, but I think we're doing a much better job overall to really keep our heads out of the sand and tackle climate change in a much more informed manner. I think the National Adaptation Forum gathering and these webinars are a really important opportunity to try and encourage all of us to keep away from this third response and our colleagues away from this as well. So our core mission at EcoAdapt is to help people figure out how to do what they do effectively in a changing climate. And we do that by providing support, training, and assistance to make planning and management less vulnerable. Our core philosophy essentially boils down to the fact that climate change is already affecting all aspects of human society and natural systems and built systems, and it's going to continue to do so. So we really need to incorporate climate change into our long-term visioning, planning, and management in order to minimize our risks and maximize our successes. We typically use the teach a man to fish adage to describe our work, which falls under these 5 categories. So we have the State of Adaptation program, which is where we find out how people are fishing or how people are doing adaptation. We have Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, or CAKE, which is where we connect people who are working on adaptation in an online environment. Through our Awareness to Action program, we do trainings to teach other people how to do adaptation. In adaptation consultation, we'll actually do some adaptation for you, whether that's a vulnerability assessment or creating a monitoring framework. And then finally, of course, there's the National Adaptation Forum, which is where we try to gather adaptation practitioners to learn from one another in an in-person environment. So as Alex mentioned, this project is part of our State of Adaptation program, which I created and now manage. It's an initiative, a sustained research initiative, in which we interview and survey practitioners, and as much as possible try and assess the adaptation efforts that are happening on the ground. We then develop case studies of adaptation in action, attempt to synthesize trends, opportunities, and challenges, and then connect people to case studies, reports, and other resources to really build the adaptation field. We've been doing these surveys since 2009. We have about over probably 30,500 interviews and surveys in marine and coastal North America, the Great Lakes region, the Western United States and Canada, marine fisheries, and now the Southeast Caribbean, US. And we have about 400 plus case studies that have been cited by a number of different groups. The project that is the focus of today's webinar is part of the State of Adaptation program. We became really interested in water resources, particularly through our other surveys. We found that it was a good way to engage with people on the climate issue. And so in this project, we're looking at inland freshwater resources and also coastal areas that are at the confluence of freshwater and marine environments. We received funding in 2013 from the Mott Foundation to survey Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Arkansas. And then we received funding from the Munson Foundation in 2015 to add Florida, the Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands to this survey. CAKE has also generously provided some in-kind support time as well. So through this project, we've done a climate impacts and adaptation literature review and synthesis. We've done these interviews and some surveys with some case study examples, as well as a needs assessment and tools analysis that Whitney and I will be talking about today, and then creating a synthesis report with some guidance, if possible, that will be helpful to people in the region and hopefully beyond. So I just want to give a little bit of background on some climate change impacts of concern to regional water resources. We obviously live an aquatic life. This is one of my very favorite movies, so any chance I have to include it in a presentation, I'm happy. The location of water has obviously dictated demographic patterns and cultural activities throughout human history, but it also poses a hazard to people and to the natural resources and built systems that they rely upon. So climate-driven changes that we're experiencing, such as changes in air and water temperature, precipitation, sea and lake level change, and water chemistry, are having and will continue to have some really major implications for human communities and natural environments, as well as built systems. However, the predictions of these changes and the effects are difficult because how much and how soon really depends on what's done on greenhouse gas emissions, the sensitivity and vulnerability of our natural and built systems, and then also the level of our preparedness. This map shows some percent increases in the amount of precipitation falling as heavy events from 1958 to 2012 for each region of the continental United States. Shows a 27% increase for the Southeast states and a 33% increase for the U.S. Caribbean. This figure shows a summary of the number of times each state has been affected by weather and or climate events between 1980 to 2015 that have resulted in more than $1 billion US in damages. So for the region, things like hurricanes, tornadoes, and winter storms are the main culprits. In addition, there have been some major flooding events forced by heavy rainfall, in some cases up to 300% of the quote-unquote normal or typical amount, especially along the Mississippi River and its tributaries, which have caused millions of dollars of damage to agricultural lands and property in Arkansas, Tennessee, and Louisiana, for example. Sea level rise is, of course, of a big concern in the region. These two, phenomena that it's attributed to: thermal expansion, obviously, as the ocean absorbs heat and warms; water expands, which causes global sea level rise to increase; and then warmer air temperatures are also increasing the rate of melting and freshwater input from glaciers and terrestrial ice caps into the ocean. And we have seen about an 8-inch increase from 1880 to 2009. And our future scenarios have some pretty big ranges, but in the region, what's interesting is that there are some local factors that really contribute to the extent of sea level rise, including things like land subsidence and water and oil withdrawals. So this image maps the relative coastal vulnerability of the Southeast Atlantic and Gulf Coast states to sea level rise. So you can see very high to high rankings, especially along the coast of Louisiana, Florida, and North Carolina. And these rankings include factors such as coastal slope, shoreline erosion and accretion, and mean wave height. And all of these climate-driven factors will have cascading impacts, including coastal and riverine flooding, the increased effects of storms and amplified storm surges that reach further inland, increased drought, changes in coastal ecosystems, which may actually cause, wholesale shifts in whole vegetation communities, increased erosion, changes in habitat availability and quality, decreased water quality, and perhaps even some decreased recreation and tourism opportunities more locally. And these impacts are compounded by non-climate stressors such as rapid population growth, which has expanded exponentially, especially in coastal watershed counties, including primarily in urban areas. So in the State of Adaptation program, we typically categorize the examples we collect by overarching strategies, which include things like reducing non-climate stressors that interact with climate factors, establishing protected areas and vulnerable sites, and also increasing capacity to undertake and implement adaptation. For this project, we also wanted to identify water-specific adaptation options, which we did by these 4 categories. So we were concerned about supply, quality, delivery, and demand and use. So we think about water supply, that's how much there is; water quality, how clean it is; water delivery, how it gets where it needs to go or prevents where it needs to go; and water demand and use, which is how much is used and why. So I just want to give some examples of the type of actions we're categorizing our findings by under each of these. So for water supply, you can think of things like increasing and or diversifying water supplies and storage capacity. So that might be creating new or protecting existing reservoirs and retention ponds, considering future conditions in water pricing and water trading, increasing capacity for desalinization, which of course is incredibly expensive, but may be in some areas, a last resort or a primary resort, depending on how people are thinking about it. Other strategies include protecting freshwater ecosystems and creating drought mitigation plans, including drought monitoring and early warning systems. For, oops, I skipped ahead. For water, somebody else controlling my, okay, for water quality, there we go. For water quality, you can think of integrating climate indicators into water quality monitoring, monitoring surface water conditions and vegetation changes in the watershed, increasing capacity for the treatment of degraded water as well. Water delivery, we're certainly thinking of things like limiting development along riparian and coastal areas within vulnerable watersheds, improving flood protection measures, ideally increasing the soft measures as opposed to the hard measures like seawalls and dikes and jetties, implementing green infrastructure such as rain gardens, pervious pavements, green roofs, swales, etc., implementing watershed management, so it's really thinking through a watershed approach to managing runoff, mimicking natural features and hydrology. And finally, for water demand and use, especially thinking through water conservation efforts and trying to balance the needs of different groups of people. For example, in the region, balancing water demand and use by residents and agricultural uses is really important in order to regulate water shortages and quality issues that are associated with climate change, and trying to increase water reuse and recycling efforts as well. So we conducted a ton of interviews and surveys with water resources professionals, including utility managers, natural resource managers, scientists, conservation planners, and representatives from different advocacy groups in the region to try and gather information on how people were thinking about climate change and water resources. And through the course of these interviews, a lot of the feedback was that although people were really interested and concerned with climate change and maybe wanted to take action in several cases, they still really struggled with how to identify, prioritize, and utilize tools and approaches that could actually support the integration of climate change into what they do. And so to that end, we added a needs assessment survey component to the project to try and gather specific details on the perceived needs of people in the region, on information, resources, and tools that people are using and or need to integrate climate change into their work. So I wanted to give a couple of sample results to date. We have received 258 responses. As far as those responses go, water quality, people have the option to select multiple choices here. But as far as what best describes the focus of individuals, respondents, or their organization's interest in water resources, water quality and water delivery seem to be the highest. As far as do you think climate change has had or is having or is likely to have a significant effect, the overwhelming response was yes. Very small response of no, which is great to see, although when we start talking about barriers, you'll see that believing it does not necessarily mean that action has been enabled. As far as how well informed you feel you are about climate change, most everyone felt really well informed. Only about 5% felt that they were not well informed or not at all informed about climate change. And have you ever incorporated climate change or an aspect of climate change into your water-related efforts? About 73% of the folks said yes. In some capacity, they have incorporated climate change or at least climate variables into their water-related efforts. However, there are some really significant challenges to integrating climate change. Lack of funding always across the board is a big issue to integrating climate change. But of interest here are things like current and more pressing issues, no legal mandate, and especially things like lack of stakeholder demand and opposition from stakeholder groups, and even that lack of leadership. People really expressed that not having the support to do it or being actively barred from doing it, from integrating climate change into different ways in which they work, was a major barrier to taking the action that they wanted to take. We also asked what kind of information is used to make decisions at work, as well as what kind of information they would want. So best practices, scientific literature, case studies, gray literature, those are typically all of the ones that we see in every survey that we do. And just along the lines, you can see that people are really interested in finding out how people are doing this in other areas so that these can be lessons learned that they bring back to their own place of work. With respect to the top needs identified, People, again, are really interested in even more best practices and lessons learned, even more case studies, and then getting more specific on things like guidance on how to integrate climate change into water resources conservation and management, guidance on communicating climate issues to the public, to the stakeholders, to their fellow stakeholders, and even to their officials and bosses in some cases. That was really important to folks. And then example policies, ordinances, and model codes. How have people done this before? Are there existing policies that can be taken advantage of in order to really integrate climate change into water resources planning and management? So I just want to give two snapshot examples of the type of action we're seeing before we have Andrea and Chris, who are going to give us more detailed examples. So one is the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge in North Carolina. If you remember from the map earlier, North Carolina is incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise. Storm surge, flooding, saltwater intrusion are all major issues there. The Nature Conservancy and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are working together to test 3 adaptive management strategies to determine the approaches that will enhance the overall refuge system resilience. So they're evaluating 3 strategies here. The first is using oyster reefs to dissipate wave energy, try and slow currents and reduce shoreline erosion. And an added benefit there for the project leads is that these reefs actually can help in carbon sequestration and also provide habitat for a variety of species. The second approach is using water control structures that are equipped with flashboard risers and tide gates to try and restore the hydrologic regime and prevent saltwater intrusion into the area. And the third is more of a response or transition approach, which is planting salt and flood tolerant vegetation like bald cypress and black gum to try and enhance future shoreline stability, combat expected biodiversity and habitat loss as well. And so they're testing all 3 of these to see what works best or what configuration of these strategies work best to figure out what might work along the shoreline. And so it's a really good example of restoring natural conditions to try and minimize climate change impacts, limiting salinization, improving flood protection measures, et cetera. And also it's a great example of monitoring for adaptation to try and figure out which strategies will work best or which configuration of strategies will work best on the ground. Additionally, Sumner County, Tennessee works through the Model Forest Policy Program's Climate Solutions University to create a climate change adaptation plan, which builds off of their comprehensive land use plan for the county. So they looked at the combined effects of climate change and population growth on forest and water resources in the county and prioritized several climate-informed actions. Among those were things like protecting headwater streams, changing zoning policies and practices to try and reduce flood risk, and also creating a monitoring network. So this is a good example of incorporating future conditions into planning and policy and diversifying water storage capacity, protecting freshwater ecosystems, and improving flood protection measures. So next, I want to pass it over to Whitney, who's going to share some background about our efforts to assess the tools that are available to regional practitioners. And I will pass it over to her now.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Okay, so the last segment of our project, as Rachel just mentioned, really focuses on exploring the resources and tools that are available to support climate-informed water management. So as we interviewed practitioners and ran our needs assessment survey, one of the emerging themes is that there is a perceived lack of tools and resources available to support climate-informed water management in the region. Additionally, there is an oft-cited barrier that folks lack the time or capacity to find and understand the available tools in order to inform their climate adaptation efforts. So to address these issues, EcoAdapt really wanted to explore and document what tools and resources exist within the region to support climate-informed water management. So through our own knowledge and expertise, conversations with regional partners and practitioners, and from tools submitted to the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange and discussed the National Adaptation Forum, we have identified over 50 tools and resources from both regional and national sources that can be used to integrate climate change and adaptation into water resources management and planning. The majority of these tools are open access, meaning that anyone can access them and use them for free. And for the few that aren't open access, they typically just require a partnership for use, which is a great way to build capacity across sectors and across different organizations. All of these tools will be compiled into a guide, which will be in our final report, and they will also be integrated with the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website and shared with other partners. But more than simply identifying what tools exist, EcoAdapt really wanted to catalog these tools in a way that makes it easier for practitioners to identify what tools will be most relevant for their work. And so we hope that this cataloging method will help address the time and capacity issue, which is cited as a barrier, by compiling and distilling this key tool information into one place. So I just want to quickly review how it is that we did this cataloging process so that you know what kind of information will be available to you when our report is released. So the first level of cataloging involved categorizing each tool by type, of which we have 6 different types. So visualization tools can be used to visualize how climate impacts may play out across your landscape. These are great tools for communicating with the public as well because they provide a visual representation that's usually easy to digest. We have modeling tools, such as the Climate Wizard, which allow you to identify projections specific to your geographic area of interest. This can help get at the lack of downscaled climate data barrier by providing regional projections. There are also decision support tools which help guide you through the decision-making process and consider what adaptation options are available to you. Monitoring tools, such as the Drought Risk Atlas, they allow you to, let's go backwards. They allow you to monitor the impacts of climate change as they play out, as well as to monitor and track your own project's process so that you can adapt and adjust moving forward. We also have communication and outreach tools, which will allow you to share and document your own experience, as well as learn from the experiences of others. And lastly, we have resource portals, which are online hubs that compile information or can direct you to a variety of other water management and adaptation resources should you need additional tools or support. We've also cataloged every tool according to the phase of adaptation it supports. So whether you're just beginning your adaptation journey and thinking about how climate change may affect you, or whether you've completed an adaptation project and are ready to share your results, there's a tool that can help you do that. Each tool is also categorized according to the water subsector that it supports and the audiences and sectors it's intended for. So really, no matter where you are on your journey, what water resources you manage, or who you're trying to reach, we have a tool in this catalog that can support what it is you're trying to do. To give you an example of what all this information looks like when it's compiled, this is a sample tool profile for Open NSPEC. So as you can see, for each tool, we've summarized the tool title, where it can be found on the web, who developed it, and their contact information, so you can directly contact them for further support. All of the different catalog information is presented below, as well as a description of EcoAdapt's interpretation of what the tool is, what it can be used for, and what type of information the user needs to provide. So this may be a certain kind of software like ArcGIS, or it can be specific data from your region that you integrate into the tool to get more specific results. Lastly, for each tool, where possible, we've identified an example in use of the tool in use in the Southeast United States, because often understanding how the tool has been used and applied can be really helpful in informing your own adaptation work. So all of this information will be available for all of the 50 tools that we've identified. And as I said, it will be available in our report and on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange. Additionally, if there is a tool that you feel has been incredibly useful in your own adaptation work, we encourage you to submit it to us. Rachel's contact information will be available at the end of the webinar, and please submit those to us as soon as possible so we have time to review them and integrate them. But now we'd like to transition into the second part of our webinar. We have 2 guests with us today from the Southeast United States, Andrea Webster and Chris Burkett. Andrea Webster is a project manager in Louisville Metro Government's Office of Sustainability. In this capacity, Andrea manages the department's city stat program, SustainStat, coordinates cross-functional teams to mitigate urban heat island issues,
and champions additional projects and programs to achieve the goals in the city's sustainability plan, Sustain Louisville. Andrea received a Master of Public Administration from the Maxwell School of Syracuse University and a Master of Science in Environmental Studies from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Also joining us is Chris Burkett, who is the Wildlife Action Plan Coordinator from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. Chris has coordinated the agency's climate change planning and research since 2008 and has worked to incorporate climate change with Virginia's updated Wildlife Action Plan, a document that works to keep species from becoming endangered. Chris frequently works with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program on issues related to agency effectiveness, funding, and policy. We're very excited to have both Andrea and Chris with us today because they will be sharing their experiences about integrating climate change into water resources management. They represent great examples of adaptation activities underway in the Southeast region, including a diverse look at adaptation occurring in urban and natural resource landscapes and at local and state levels. They're also dealing with a variety of water management challenges in a changing climate, including flooding, stormwater management, drought, and maintaining water quality, supply, and delivery to human and natural communities, which are likely changes that many of our listeners are grappling with as well. So we hope that you are able to learn from their experiences. A very warm welcome to both of you, Andrea and Chris, and now over to Andrea. I think you're up first.
All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction. Today I'd like to share with you what Louisville, Kentucky is doing to mitigate and plan for climate change. But first, a little about Louisville. There we go. All right, so Louisville is home to the Kentucky Derby, the Bourbon Trail, and we're also known as the gateway to the South. So just a few months ago, we were selected in the final round of the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative. And back in 2015, we received a 4-star rating from the Star Communities rating system. Louisville is located within a coal state. We are one of the states that are suing the EPA in the Clean Power Plan. And while our office and many of our residents recognize that coal is a driver of greenhouse gases, we're also continuously reminded that we have low energy costs because of coal. So we have manufacturing because of coal, and we have jobs because of coal. Coal is a driver in our economy and in the state, so we're continually reminded of that. I think earlier Rachel had mentioned that opposition from stakeholder groups can be inhibiting some of our initiatives, and that's definitely a legitimate concern here in Louisville. So Louisville is located on the Ohio River, which is a tributary to the Mississippi. We are a water-rich city, and we're expected to receive more rainfall as a result of climate change. So one example is that just last year in April of 2015, Louisville received 5 to 7 inches of rain in about 6 hours. The storm resulted in more than 100 water rescues, most of which occurred in areas with a low median household income, which is about $15,000 in Louisville, or in neighborhoods with a heavy population of underrepresented residents. So the effects of the storms caused mudslides, up to 8 to 10 feet of standing water, closing several major intersections and interstate ramps. We washed out roads. So in general, it taxed our emergency response systems greatly. So when we think about climate change in Louisville, many of our goals focus on projects that reduce heat and reduce chances for flooding. Another thing to know about Louisville is how easy it is to park downtown. So this is a picture of our central business district. So the red indicates surface parking and purple is the single-use garages. We have so many parking lots, in fact, that earlier this year we received the Golden Crater from Streets Blog USA in a March Madness style tournament. So the photo that you're looking at here is of Sobro, which is a district that is just south of our central business district. And we're working to turn that area into an eco-district. So currently, it is over 80% impervious surface and has a 9% tree canopy. So just for a frame of reference, the most cities recommend having a 45% tree canopy on average across the city. So this is a list that we certainly do not want to be at the top of. Another list that we do not wish to be at the top of is this one. So in 2012, a study released by the Urban Climate Lab at Georgia Tech showed that Louisville had the most rapidly growing, or is the most rapidly growing urban heat island in the country. So this is one of our major challenges. So to combat some of these issues, we have a sustainability plan. So this is not a plan that sits on the shelf. It was adopted in 2013, and we report annually on progress. We have 17 goals, and the ownership of these 17 goals and over 80 initiatives within the plan are spread out across metro government, so and even into the community in some cases. So we have departments outside of the Office of Sustainability managing some of these goals and working towards metrics within these goals. So we are in the process of developing metrics for all the goals within our city stat program, which was mentioned earlier is called Sustain Stat here in Louisville. All right, so one example of this is Sustain Louisville Goal 5, which is to improve waterway quality. So the EPA's list of segments on the 303D list is the metric that we use to measure this goal. So the EPA has a list of lakes, stream segments, and rivers that do not meet one or more water quality standards as required by Section 303D of the Clean Water Act. So we set the metric based on that list, and we're starting to make some progress. Another initiative with under Goal 5 of Sustain Louisville is to reduce the annual number of sanitary sewer overflows, or SSOs, into our waterways. So Louisville is under a consent decree with the EPA, and it requires us to get down to 8 overflows per year on average within the combined sewer system. But this initiative, shown here at the bottom, allows us to set a goal outside of that geographic area. So we're trying to eliminate sanitary sewer overflows completely by 2024. And as you can see, we're already down to 191, so we are making progress. We have another initiative, which is to restore riparian vegetation in Louisville, specifically 10 miles. So right now we're focusing on the Beargrass Creek, which is our most polluted stream, urban stream in the city. And so we are in the process of launching a conceptual plan in partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers and several other departments within Louisville and community groups to restore about 1.6 miles. At the same time, we are trying to connect the missing link to a hike and bike trail that connects downtown residents to district. So it has a bit of a dual purpose where we're restoring riparian vegetation and creating a corridor, an alternative transportation corridor within the city. So we also have green infrastructure incentives in Louisville. So we're doing our best to leverage the knowledge of other entities as much as possible within Louisville. And so this incentive works particularly well for that regard. So on average, these incentives combined with MSD's incentives cover about 75 to 80% of project costs. So there's almost no, combined with the payback that you receive from green infrastructure project, there's almost no disincentive to not do it. So another goal within Sustain Louisville is to mitigate climate change impacts, one of which in Louisville is rising temperatures. So in Louisville, urban heat island initiatives are a launch pad for resiliency, mitigation, and adaptation initiatives. Urban heat islands are important for several reasons, one of which is that in most large cities in the U.S., urban zones are warming at twice the rate of rural zones, and at about twice the rate of the planet as a whole. So it's a big issue. So the Natural Resource Defense Council estimates that 257 Louisville citizens will die from heat-related causes by 2050. And that's the highest of all U.S. cities. So this is a big issue that we're working on, and we hope to make some major strides within the next couple of years. So just a couple of months ago, we released the urban heat management study shown here, and the link that's just above it is where you can find it. It's the most comprehensive UHI study that we believe in the country and maybe even around the globe. So what's unique about this study is that it provides modeled temperature data at 2 meters above ground, whereas most studies will show surface temperature. So because it's 2 meters above ground, that's the space where residents actually feel heat. And that's what this map shows. So how residents feel temperature on average. The study also provides granular data that tells us how many trees we should plant, how many green roofs and white roofs we should install, and how much barren land, for example, we should convert to grass in every single neighborhood. So it's at the neighborhood level. So neighborhood leaders can take this information and really use it in a tangible way to convert their neighborhoods into better places to live and that help to cool the city at the same time. So to fix some of these issues, we have established several cross-functional teams that are evaluating possible projects, and we're expecting to release a mitigation strategy later this year. Some of the things we're looking at are cool pavement options for roadways. So many folks, there's a lot of information around the country about cool pavements for parking lots, but for roadways, it's been a bit more challenging to find more information. Permeable asphalt is obviously one example. Gridding is another. We're also starting to look at colored asphalt options. As it turns out, the clear binders that are used in Europe are not available for purchase in the US. So this has been a bit more challenging than we expected, but we are working with some local researchers around Louisville to figure out a solution. We have also overlaid planned paving projects with our urban heat island map so that we can see where we want to prioritize testing cool pavement options. So the dark red areas on the map are the planned paving within the next year. And so we hope that we can find some testing grounds for us through the winter months specifically. So we are also testing or exploring a solution to place trees in parking lots without losing any spaces, believe it or not. So the plan is to plant trees about a foot deep and then cover their roots with the permeable asphalt. So you just kind of have a tree sticking out at the corner and you don't lose any spaces. We hope to do the first pilot project of this fall once planting season is back in session for us. We're also in the process of launching a UHI, or Urban Heat Island, marketing strategy in July and August to teach people what an urban heat island is, why it's important in Louisville, and then how to mitigate our urban heat island, and most importantly, how to survive hot weather. So part of this information is teaching people who to call to figure out where your cooling center is, and just generally how to stay cool, to crack your windows in the summertime if you don't have air conditioning, those types of things. So we have many strategies that we're leading to prepare for the impacts of climate change, many of which address flooding and rising heat as well. And at this stage, we are looking forward to engaging with 100 resilient cities to pursue some of these ideas even further. And with that, I guess I'll pass it on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Chris?
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. My name's Chris Burkett. I'm the Wildlife Action Plan Coordinator for the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. And my colleagues and I spend almost all of our time trying to think of ways to keep species from becoming endangered, right? And we do that for lots of different reasons. But we find that Virginia's Wildlife Action Plan is a really useful tool for talking about climate change and thinking about climate change adaptation, both in the near and the longer terms. Okay, I'm not sure that oh, there we go. All right, so while I have you here, a couple things I would like to discuss. Give you just a quick background about our historic climate change planning efforts, just so that you can understand what it's taken us to get to this point. Part of that is a philosophical stance, something that we've learned along the ways that I want to share that I don't see being talked about much in the national discussions of climate change adaptation. And then talk about how we went about integrating climate change into our wildlife action plan, into that thinking about how to keep species from becoming endangered. And I'll give you some examples of things that we're asking for, as well as an example, show you what implementation actually looks like. All right. Okay, so in terms of climate change planning, we have been working and thinking about climate change adaptation since 2008, and this document cover that you're looking at represents a joint effort by my agency, the National Wildlife Federation, and the Virginia Conservation Network to, for the first time, really think about how do we help wildlife adapt to changing climatic conditions. And we had scores, literally scores of partners from all over the state, from agencies and municipalities and NGOs and private individuals that were really interested in coming and talking with us. We got a huge amount of feedback once we started asking questions about what were people's concerns. Now, the amazing thing is, as we wrote this document, it ended up being surprisingly short. It's only about 30 pages with wide margins and large font and color photos. But what it does is it describes 10 strategies that we could start working on that day to help us prepare for changing climatic conditions. And there are things that are common. Lots of states are doing them, downscale climate models and species threats assessments, and all sorts of new data is always coming in, so we're working to incorporate that. And that was really a useful set of tools. And we learned a lot from this process. I think it was really informative, and we ended up in a place that was far removed from where we started. Okay. But one of the things that we learned, and this is, some of you are going to get mad at this, but we kind of, after years of discussion, we finally got to a point where we realized that climate change for us, in our situation, isn't a threat in and of itself. Now, if you listen to the national discussions about climate change, so many people are talking about climate change like it's some grand behemoth, that's just lumbering along and it is going to squish everything in its path. And that's, once we really got into the discussions and thinking about climate change from a management perspective, that's not what we were finding. Okay? Now, we agree, climate change is going to make things worse, but we don't talk about it as being something removed, something new, something that is operates in isolation. Essentially, the way we talk about climate change is more like an adjective or an adverb. It's an intensifier. And so if you have problems now, chances are climate change is going to make them worse. And so for us, big issues with wildlife, habitat loss and habitat fragmentation, both of them are going to get worse with changing climatic conditions. We expect new diseases, new invasive species are going to be able to get a foothold in Virginia and do well here to the detriment of our native wildlife. We've got ongoing water quality and water quantity issues. Climate change is going to make those worse. So we don't talk about climate change as being an independent issue. It really is related to the ongoing threats, the ongoing challenges we have with Virginia's wildlife. Once we came to this conclusion, then adaptation discussions became a lot easier. They weren't nearly as tortured as they were. All right, let's see if I can get the next slide. All right, and so our climate change discussion our adaptation philosophy can really be summed up in one sentence. And that sentence is: healthy populations in healthy habitats are going to have the best chance of adapting to changing climatic conditions. And for us, where we are now, it really is as simple as that. And so as we were writing our new wildlife action plan, we really took this sentence to heart in terms of design and creating this new document. So within our plan, we really focus on prioritizing areas where we already have high quality habitats, identifying areas where we can restore degraded habitats, and looking for opportunities where we connect these small habitat fragments into much larger habitat pieces. Now, we feel that's going to be our best chance of success at this point. The map you're seeing here is the central Shenandoah Valley. The dark blue areas indicate watersheds where we have high quality water resources already existing. And so one of the things we talk about in our action plan is those are areas that we want to make sure we preserve. The areas that are in yellow indicate places where we have degraded water quality, and there are things that we can do there to improve that. All right, so what do we actually ask for? Well, as a planner, I don't think we can be too blunt in articulating what we want to see happen on the ground. So for aquatic and riparian habitats, our rivers are screamingly important. Out of the 884 species we've identified as of concern in our action plan, probably 75% of them live in our rivers and riparian areas. So I can't overstress the importance of those habitats. So statewide, we looked at trying to identify and prioritize places that are already in really good shape, because those are places we want to make sure that we conserve, because it's a lot easier to keep them that way than it is to try and restore them later. We also identify areas, watersheds all across the state where we'd like to see increased riparian buffers, where we'd like to maintain and restore connectivity by removing dams or re-engineering culverts and road crossings. And then finally, probably one of the most valuable things we can do if we want to keep species like brook trout is try and find ways to eliminate bad things from flowing into our rivers. So things like animal runoff or sediment or fertilizers that have such a tremendous impact at the point of entry, as well as flowing downstream into the Chesapeake Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, those sorts of places. Right. And we have a similar sort of statements when it comes to wetlands. Again, another critically important habitat type for scores of our action plan species. And in this case, we ended up taking existing data that our heritage program in Virginia has put together that identify where we have really high quality wetland complexes so that we can focus on working to maintain those resources. But we also start thinking about identified priority areas that have been degraded and looking at the opportunities we have to make them better. So things like creating and maintaining vegetative buffers around existing wetlands to improve the habitat and the water quality there. Working to improve water quality upstream, so like preventing erosion, that sort of thing. And then on the coastal areas, we have a number of coastal marshes that are really important habitats for lots and lots of species. Sea level rise, we can't really do anything about that. I mean, sea level is going to do what sea level is going to do. Our biggest management opportunity is really focusing in on where can we conserve and acquire land inland and upland from existing tidal marshes, hopefully giving them some place to migrate over time as sea levels change. And so we pulled in models from a number of different sources to help us prioritize places on our coastal areas where acquisition may be more preferable. All right. Now the big question, it's one thing to write a plan, it's another thing to actually put it into play. And I get this question all the time. So what does implementation look like now that you've set up this grand idea? Well, I'm happy to say we're actually moving forward on implementation. And our biggest issues involve finding viable projects with willing landowners. So we're developing and encouraging partnerships with partners and landowners, trying to identify places where we can put boots on the ground and do some good. Now, obviously, we don't have enough money to take care of every issue that occurs, but in a lot of circles, wildlife action plans do carry some weight as prioritization tools. So we're able to use some of our federal money, called state wildlife grant dollars, as seed money. Sometimes that's enough to make projects viable and get things on the ground. Sometimes that's enough to encourage private organizations to support projects with grant funds or other resources. All right. This is a picture of one project that we're trying to pull together with a town in the central Shenandoah Valley. This cut bank is 700 feet long and about 20 feet wide at its highest point, and dumps literally tons and tons and tons of sediment into the Shenandoah River and ultimately the Chesapeake Bay every year. This is the sort of thing we're trying to address at this point, working with partners to fix these problems that are such eyesores. But then it really comes down, once you've done that, you've got to document your success and promote yourself a little bit. It's really important that we help people understand why this is an important thing for us to do, both in Virginia, and why people should care, why that's a good thing for Virginians. All right, this is just my last slide. And from what I can tell, we're doing some things differently than a lot of other states. And we've gotten some criticisms over the years, most of it constructive, but we have gotten some criticisms that we are diverging a little bit from the norm. And so I just want to walk through a couple of those real quick and some of our responses. The first one deals with, this is actually a quote I got at a conference a couple of years ago. Had somebody stand up after a presentation and say, you guys really aren't climate changey enough. That's their term, climate changey. And so I had to hunt that person down afterwards and really twist their arm over about a course of an hour trying to figure out what they meant, because that just doesn't resonate with me. And eventually what we came to is they were concerned that we weren't being sufficiently technical. So much of the climate change literature is full of statistics and models and maps and error bars and things that if you don't live in that world, just really confuse you and turn you off. And so finally I just had to say, look, we're not going to go there, because we need this climate change strategy to be action oriented. We need people to understand what we want them to do. We can't afford to have them shut down at the beginning before we get to the ask. We need to facilitate action. And if we're overly complicated, overly technical, we cut that off at the knees, and we just don't want to do that. Another one that we've gotten a few times deals with phenology, and that's that notion that the timing of biological events, and it's been a significant area of research related to climate change. And a good example in the mid-Atlantic of a phenology concern is right now when horseshoe crabs start to spawn in the Chesapeake and the Delaware bays. That just happens to coincide with bird migration. So you get birds like red knots flying through the region from South America. When they get here, they're just famished. And so it's a real boon to find a high-protein, very abundant food source. Now you start messing with the timing of when those horseshoe crabs spawn, you can really put a hurt on these bird populations. And so these phenology changes that are being caused by climate change can have a real impact on a number of endangered species. We don't really address that in our wildlife action plan. And it's not that we don't care, but just after the course of a day's worth of discussions with folks, we really couldn't think of anything we could do about it. So how much time do you spend talking to people about problems that we can address versus how much time do you spend talking with people about things we can address? And so we just made our decision. We really wanted to focus on things that we can do right now. If people can come up with some good phenology-related actions, we can incorporate them. But for right now, we're just focusing elsewhere. And the final criticism that we've gotten really comes from the outreach side of things. A lot of people in the conservation community are really frustrated that as an agency, we don't really go after anybody. We don't lay a lot of criticism. We don't point fingers or lay blame on anybody. So we don't talk about coal. We don't talk about cars. We don't talk about feedlot cattle. We don't talk about any of the other, myriad of things out there. And it's not that these aren't issues. They are, but this is also a long-standing communication guideline that we created. This was in the first meeting when we first started our planning efforts back in 2008. We kind of came to the decision that as a civilization, we got here together. We have all benefited from cheap, abundant energy. All right. As a civilization, we're either going to get out of this together or we're not, and we can't afford to alienate potential partners. And I know that rubs some people the wrong way, and we've had to pull out of some partnerships with folks that couldn't accommodate that socio-political economic perspective. But that's just the way it is, and we have to move forward. So with anything, anyway, I could literally talk for days and days on action plans and climate change, but I won't. We're kind of running short on time, and I'm sorry, but look forward to your questions, and you can either today or you can contact me afterwards. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. That's awesome. So I just wanted to just let you guys know all of this information, these 2 case studies, and all of the information that we've been collecting is gonna be available on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, which, if you're not aware, is at cakex.org, and it's a project that we have created in partnership with a bunch of different folks, including the list of people listed here. You may even see your own name, but it's a really good opportunity to search for different adaptation tools, case studies, and resources in a variety of different ways. So if you haven't been there already, I really encourage you to join. Also, I just wanted to let you know, we are going to have a couple of things still open. As Whitney mentioned, if you feel that there's a tool that's been particularly useful to you or that you want to make sure is part of our report, please feel free to send that to us. My email is at the bottom of the page here, rachel@ecoadapt.org. I would say the same for any case study or project that you feel like you really want to have represented or make sure that it's represented in the report. Please share that with us. We can always do updates on CAKE as well in any case studies. And then just as a last appeal, I'm going to leave the needs assessment survey open for another 2 weeks until the beginning of July. So if you haven't had a chance to take that survey yet and want to have your thoughts known, please feel free to take that as well. And then I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. And Alex, I don't know, do we have time for a question?
Let's take a couple questions if you guys don't mind going over a few minutes. I have 2 specific questions, one for Andrea and one for Chris, and then one general to you, Rachel. So I'll start a question for Andrea by Sonia Baez Hernandez. And for one, she thanks you for the presentation, and she is asking if you could discuss specific adaptations in Louisville that address communities. You had mentioned cooling centers and trees. Does your study address floods, premature death? Do you have any other resources that you could share? Sonia is the population that she serves is in the Miami, Florida area.
So we have not completed a full-scale climate adaptation study yet, so I think that will be coming within the next year or 2. But in terms of the communities that we work with and that we're planning for, I would say that we have been trying to address all communities with our urban heat island adaptation strategies and mitigation strategies. So we're working with several different radio stations around town to help get the message out. And we're going to be working with Meals on Wheels to hand out little thermometers for folks to put in their homes so that they can measure temperatures in their homes, because that's where a lot of the heat-related illnesses happen. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I'm happy to dive further, or feel free to reach out to me individually.
Well, thank you. That was good. And then Wendy Smith had a comment for Chris, stating that she likes your approach. Have you been able to get consensus on protecting lands and increasing buffers, especially from private landowners?
Sometimes. It's tough to lump all landowners into a single group. We find that some of them have a very strong conservation ethic, and as soon as we can point out there's an issue, they are eager to work with us to fix a problem. We've got others that have to be drug into it, kicking and screaming. So there's always that outreach balance of how do you reach the people there in the middle. It's a work in progress.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge in many regions as well. And this one is from Kirsten Lackstrom to Rachel and Whitney. In your interviews and surveys, what did you hear from water system managers about their actions or plans to adapt to climate change?
That level of specificity we'll have in our report itself. I wouldn't feel comfortable representing that right now, but we'll be sure to break out all of those answers in the report itself.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. And as just a follow-up question to that, everybody is really interested in the report and tools guide. When can we expect it to be available?
Oh, right. I was supposed to mention that. Thank you. We are planning on releasing that in September or October, depending on how much feedback we get from this webinar and from the handful of case studies and different pieces of the report that we currently have out for peer review. We're hoping for a September release date. And what we'll do as well is do another follow-up webinar in the fall featuring more case study leads as well. So there'll be some opportunities to engage in the future on this project. And we hope to make it a key piece of the CAKE platform, because as we were doing all of these surveys, engaging with people around water in the Southeast was a much easier way to enter into conversations. I mean, Chris sort of mentioned this, climate change is an intensifier of issues rather than the primary way to communicate with people. And we certainly found that to be true as well. So it's a gateway way to communicate with folks in the region. So I think we'll certainly be expanding on the topic in the future as well.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rachel, Whitney, Andrea, and Chris for participating in the webinar today. Again, these are quarterly webinars that we do through the National Adaptation Forum. If you have any recommendations for future webinars, please feel free to contact me, Alex, at EcoAdapt.org. We are happy to partner with other folks in a variety of the adaptation topics. And last but not least, the webinar will be recorded and will be available hopefully by the end of the week. And for those that registered and missed the webinar, we'll also send you a link. And once the report comes live on the CAKE website and on the EcoAdapt website, we will send webinar attendees a reminder that it's out, so you have contact from us on that. And thank you again, everybody. Any last comments from my panel members?
No, but thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, guys. Have a great afternoon, and please join us at the next webinar in the fall. Bye-bye.